Welcome to this episode of Grassroots Advocacy. We're really glad that you're joining us. If you haven't had the opportunity, please do go back and look at the previous episodes so that you can really enjoy the full story as it relates to grassroots advocacy. In our last episode, one of the things that we covered was a request by folks out in the field to share their experiences so that we could make the concept of grassroots advocacy more timely and more relevant to what's actually happening in the field. So I had the opportunity to receive a message in social media, and I'm really thankful that this young man from the great state of Maryland shared his experience with us. And I'm really glad that he asked the questions that he asked, and we're going to look at those in just a moment. As I was reading this young man's post and trying to think about what was the best advice to give him based on his situation, I took the opportunity to read some of the various responses that other people had made, the advice that they had given. And there were a couple of things that I noticed in those responses that I'd like to share with you. One of the things is that there is a sense that all owners, operators are more concerned with the profit than they are with providing quality care. I don't believe that that's true. I do believe there are instances where that happens, but I believe more often than not, people really do care about making sure that the needs of the women and men that we care for are being met, at least to the best of our ability, given our available resources. Another thing that came out of reviewing this series of Facebook posts was that we do have a responsibility as advocates for our nation's frail, elder, and disabled citizens. We do have a responsibility to sometimes express our concerns outside of our organizations and their chains of command. And we'll talk about how to do that in more detail a little bit later on. What I'd like to ask you to do now is take a few moments to look at this post that was placed on Facebook. Now then, I hope that you had the opportunity to read that post. And something that I discovered in reading that post, there were a couple of things that came to mind as I read that post. The first thing that came to mind that really is the saddest thing is you have a young man who's been providing care for 15 years. And the situation that he was in was so bad, or he perceived it as being so bad, that he left that center. He submitted his resignation. That makes me very sad to know that 15 years of experience, that 15 years of love and compassion is no longer in our profession. And that just makes me so sad. The second thing that makes me really sad as I read this message was that this young man exercised his organization's chain of command, spoke to the ADON, spoke to the DON, spoke to the administrator, and did not feel like there was any action being taken. And we know the data tells us that nursing assistants feel as if though they are powerless, that their voice doesn't have value. And that's not true. Sometimes we just have to figure out how to speak in a different way. So that was unfortunate. Another unfortunate thing was that the needs of the people residing in that care setting were not being taken care of and were not being met, at least not to the standards of this young man, and certainly it appears not to the standards of the regulations. So what I want to do now is I want to provide my take or my advice if I were speaking with this young man directly. And I'd like to do that in the frame of the conversation that we covered very early on, which is be, know, and do. So when it comes to be, the first thing that I'd like to ask you to think about is just being the best caregiver that you can be. Not only walking the walk or talking the talk, but walking the walk. Set the right example, do the right thing, be the best person you can be. The next thing that I'd like to ask you to think about in this scenario is no. And when we talk about no, what I'd like to ask you first to do, and what I would have advised this young man to do, is I would have advised him to review the organization's policy and procedure as it relates to expressing concerns or airing grievances or reporting instances of perceived abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And the reason that I would recommend that we do that is because, let's say for the sake of discussion, in the organization's policy, it said that once you reported an issue, your supervisor, your leader, your manager has 48 hours to give you a response. Well, one of the things that could happen then is when 48 hours is up, then you go back to that person and you say, hey, look, our organization's policy and procedure says that you have 48 hours to give me an answer, and we didn't do that. So it's important to know your policy and procedure. It's also important to know the policy and procedure because if you're part of a larger organization, the buck stops with the administrator, but in larger organizations, there are typically regional directors of operations. There are other people in the hierarchy or the chain of command, if you will, that you could be reaching out to. The next thing when we talk about no that I'd like to ask you to think about is the regulations. The post-acute and long-term care environment are directed and governed and managed by 42 CRF 483. And it's important to know those regulations because those are the minimum standards. And so if an organization isn't meeting those minimum standards, that's a foundation for you to say, our residents are not receiving the nutrition and hydration that is necessary just to meet the minimum standards of the federal regulation. That's a way of framing your concern so that organizations might pay better attention. The next thing I'd like to ask you to think about is also think about your state regulations and your state reporting processes. Almost every state has an elder abuse and neglect hotline. Now, one of the things I want to caution you on is if you do a Google search and you type in elder abuse and neglect, or if you type in hotline, to make sure that you're actually going to the right place. Because what I noticed, I did a Google search this morning just to check my thinking. I typed in elder abuse and neglect, and the first 5 items on the Google search were all ads for lawyers. And you might need to eventually talk to a lawyer, but we really need to start with the state agency that is responsible for managing reports of abuse, neglect, and exploitation at the state level. That's really where we need to start to have that conversation. There's also one other thing that just occurs to me that I want to also share with you. Some nursing assistants may be uncomfortable with reporting their concerns to the state agency that's responsible for that because they might be afraid that they'll lose their job. And let's face it, we all need to be able to work. The Elder Justice Act protects a person such as yourself who is reporting observed abuse, neglect, or exploitation. So please understand that there is a mechanism in place to protect you. Now, does that mean that you can't be terminated? I'm not a lawyer, so I don't even really want to touch that, other than to say, if you're abiding by the law, you're in a much better position than if you're not. Now, the next thing that I want to say is do the right thing. And when I say do the right thing, I'm talking about doing the right thing for your residents first and foremost. So in this particular case, this young man tried to do the right thing. He tried to talk to the DON, he tried talking to the ADON, to the DON, and to the administrator. So he tried doing the right things. We don't know if he reached out to the state to report his concern or not, but at least he was trying to do the right thing. Now, if you find yourself in that same situation, please, I encourage you to always err on the side of caution for the women and men that you care for. They deserve the very best that we have to offer. And sometimes when we're providing care as a system, we get so caught up in the day-to-day routine, we get so caught up in all of the different things that are coming at us all at once, it sometimes might feel like we're a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest. That being said, our elders deserve the very best we have to offer. So always do what you believe is the best thing, the right thing for them, and also do what you believe is right for you. So I said earlier that the young man, his resignation made me sad. For him, obviously, that was the right thing to do. And so as I wrap up with today, I just want to share this quote from William Faulkner, that I think is really relevant to what we're talking about. Never be afraid to raise your voice for honesty and truth and compassion against injustice and lying and greed. If people all over the world would do this, it would change the earth. I look forward to being with you for the next episodes of Grassroots Advocacy. Until then, be well.